have to record it. We'll ask if it's recorded. So it is now being recorded. And we are just gonna do some learning together. And since we have kind of a small crew, we're gonna be able to have more conversation, I think, than we would have been able to have in a bigger group, which is great. So I want to just talk a little bit before we start about kind of what we're going to be doing and how I'm thinking about it. And then we'll just jump in because there's a lot to learn, as you can imagine. So the way it's going to work is we are going to be looking at, we're going to kind of break Kashrut down into 4 weeks, which doesn't really make sense, but that's what we're going to do. So we are going to today look at forbidden foods. Next week, we're going to look at forbidden mixtures or prohibited mixtures. Then the third week, we're going to look at sort of what does it mean to have a kosher kitchen? So dishes, kalim, koshering, Passover, all those kinds of things. And then the last week is sort of going to be a culmination of what does this all mean? What are we doing with this? And how do we use this in our lives? But we will be doing a fair amount of that every week. So you don't have to wait till 4 weeks from now to talk about modern things. We're not going to be just in the biblical stuff between now and then. But so today, for example, we're going to start in the biblical world, and then we'll end up in a modern example of how these forbidden foods lead us to certain decisions that we're making. So every week should be sort of a range of different understandings of kashrut. And so that's what we're going to do. I have 2 questions for you that I'm going to ask today. Well, many questions, but the first question I'm going to ask you all is, will you just put in the chat? It can be now, it can be later, or also you could email me. What's a question about kashrut that you're hoping to have answered in this class? Or what's a question that you have that you're not sure if it'll be answered, but just something you're sitting with? Would love to know if there are questions you're coming to the class with, so that I can also incorporate those into the learning that we're going to be doing together. So feel free to message me, put them in the chat for all of us to see them, or email me. No pressure on that. And then before we get into our texts for today, I want to think a little bit about an overarching idea of what kashrut really is, and that in some way it really is an intentional eating practice, some kind of way of entering into eating that is not just you can have anything you want anytime you want. One of my friends who's a recovering addict said, "Oh, that makes so much sense to me when you think about it as you can't always have what you want all the time," which I think is an interesting way to think about kashrut that is not always the way we think about it. But it's an intentional eating practice. And some of us in this group probably keep kosher pretty strictly, and some people in this group probably don't think about it at all. But I do think that many of us, especially in LA, have some kind of intentional eating practice. Maybe you're vegan, maybe you're paleo, maybe you do intermittent fasting, maybe you do who knows what. But will you just put in the chat, or you can unmute yourselves, because we're a small enough group, you can unmute yourselves and just share. What's your intentional eating practice, or what intentional eating practices do you already have in your lives? Whether they're kashrut or something else, no judgment on what they are, but let's just have some kind of conversation so far. Okay, vegetarian, great. Thank you, Sipra. Off to a good start. Other ones.
Vegetarian and gluten-free.
Vegetarian and gluten-free. That worries me, Marcy. That worries me for you.
Why?
I don't know. I'm just like, I worry about what you're going to eat. Okay.
Oh, honey, have you seen me? Does it look like I have trouble finding something to eat?
As long as you're not worried about it, I won't be worried about it. Jana, chicken meat eater. Okay, great. Pescatarian mostly. Okay. Other things, other intentional eating practices or ways that you think about eating when you go through the day. Or maybe it's the week. Some people maybe I know some people who are like, on Shabbat, I eat a different way than I do during the week. What other kinds of eating practices? Eating healthy, okay, great. Could mean a lot of things. Kosher style, intuitive eating, picky eater that dislikes dairy. See, these are great descriptions. We should just rename our Zoom names with our intentional eating practice descriptions. Kosher-ish, protein fiber goal, 3 vegetables minimum, intermittent fasting. See, this is what I'm talking about. Nothing is more intentional eating practices than this, than having protein, fiber goal, vegetables, intermittent fasting, kosher. Like this is exactly what kashrut is. It's just its own version. Don't like meat on bones. See, this is what I'm saying. This is exactly how specific our kashrut is that it just has all of these kinds of details. It just looks different and thinks different. Love this. No intentional eating, hence interested in working toward intentional eating. Great. Perfect. Great place to be. Great place to find yourself. Because I think is exactly, Marcy. My intentional eating practice is donuts 3 meals per day. Exactly. Good to know yourself, you know? But I really feel like if we go into our learning together with the framework of kashrut is an intentional eating practice, it will help us think through what we're looking at. Because I think sometimes it feels like I can't have this animal, but that, but not that. It's hard to stay focused on what the point is. And so I want to invite us throughout the next 4 weeks to really focus on what this lends us if we think of it as an intentional eating practice. So that's how we're going to think about it. Questions so far, thoughts, concerns, you can just jump in or raise a hand, but would love to hear any questions so far. Does it all make sense? You're with me so far? Great. Okay. So we are going to, hi, Susan, welcome. We are just going to jump into our texts this morning, this afternoon. I don't know what time it is. Okay. Noon is a weird time. It doesn't feel like morning or afternoon. It's hard to know what to say. By a show of hands, would you prefer that I share my screen with the text or just give it to you and you can look at it yourself? That's too many questions. Okay. Would you prefer that I share my screen? Will you raise your hand if you'd rather I share my screen? Okay. That seems like enough people that I will do it. And then I will also put it in the chat so that you can have it yourself as well. Sometimes it doesn't let me upload files. Let's see if today it will. Stay tuned. It's an exciting moment. Let's find out. Wow, a miracle. Okay, it is in the chat, and then I will share it with you as well. Please stay on the page that we are on. I know it's very tempting not to do that, but let's do that. Just let's try it out, as an adventure. Okay, so we are going to start with this quote from Rabbi Sheila Peltz Weinberg that I think also is a great frame for what we are going to be doing together. Can someone just jump off mute and read this for us?
Can you please make the font larger, or maybe it's just me?
I can try to do that. It will mess up all of my formatting, but I can try to do it.
You can do it on your own screen by just doing it in a large.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy. Marcy, will you read it for us?
Eating is the primary way that human beings interact with the rest of nature. We are composed of the same elements and compounds that make up our food. Indeed, when we eat, we transform a part of nature into energy that we can use for conscious purposes. The system of Kashrut causes us to pause and consider that while we are part of nature, we are endowed with a unique potential to make choices in the way we respond to life.
Great. Okay. What do we think about that? Responses to that framing. Does it resonate with you? Does it not? Any thoughts about it? Elliot?
Yeah, it's just like a very intentional way of thinking about something that you do many times a day in a way that I wouldn't normally.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's like something that we just do all the time going through the day, and we are not necessarily even conscious of how we're doing it. Susan?
It's very different from the biblical outlook that I was taught at Hebrew school, and it makes good sense. I think it's a much more modern way of looking at why we might consider what we eat and be conscious.
What was it? What was the version you were told growing up?
I was told it was to help keep us separate from other groups and to avoid intermarriage.
Oh, wow. Yes. Well, that's not the narrative you're going to hear in this class, but I totally get that for a long time, that was some of what the ways that it was brought to, especially to kids. And also, I think often kashrut is taught in a sort of fearful way also. If you don't do this, then this will happen. You have to eat this way. If you do that, there's a lot of sort of, I don't know, rigidity in those ways. And yes, there are a million rules and laws, and some of it is quite rigid. And also, I think it helps to think about it in terms of this broader reasoning. Okay, final thoughts about that, and then we're going to start looking at the texts.
I think it gives us an appreciation of what is around us as someone who hikes and so forth and looks at nature and stops to smell plants and so forth. It's just a beautiful way of, again, being in concert, being, again, highly aware of we're taking in the outside world into us. There's a beautiful sort of cycle thing going on. That's what I'm thinking immediately. Thank you.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, it invites us into a deeper connection with the world around us, the natural world around us, in ways that we often sort of overlook, and makes us think a little bit more intentionally about what is it that we're consuming and how are we consuming it. And I think that a lot of us think about that in other areas of our life too, but not always with food. Like, what are you consuming? How are you consuming it? There's a lot of conversation now about fast fashion, for example, or other kinds of things in that realm. What are the ways that we're ethically or intentionally consuming things? Okay, we're going to look at the verses from the Torah that tell us which things we can and cannot eat. These are not the mixtures. These are just the forbidden, prohibited foods themselves, because as I told you, we'll talk about mixtures next week. So let's just start with mammals. So we get 8 verses about mammals. I am going to read these and then we'll discuss them. So God spoke to Moses and Aaron saying, speak to the Israelite people. These are the creatures you can eat from among all of the land animals, which we understand to mostly be mammals. Any animal that has true hooves with clefts through the hooves and that chews the cud, such you may eat. This is one of the most famous descriptions of kashrut, I think, that we have. Split hooves and chews its cud. That's sort of the, I don't know, that's the shortcut version of what we can eat. The following, however, of those that either chew the cud or have true hooves, you cannot eat. The camel, because it chews its cud but does not have true hooves or cleft hooves, as it were, it is impure for you. The daemon, which is also known as the hyrax, which is it's kind of like a badger. It's like a small furry animal that looks in some ways like a big guinea pig of sorts. I was down a deep rabbit hole of mammals this week. Okay. Although it chews its cud, it does not have true hooves. The hare, although it chews its cud, does not have true hooves. And the swine, most famously in some ways, although it has true hooves, with the hooves cleft through, it does not chew the cud, and so it's impure for you. You shall not eat of their flesh or touch their carcasses. They are impure for you. Okay, that's a lot, and that's only just the mammals. We are going to look at 4 categories.
I have a question, are there other verses that speak to why those specific ones are considered impure?
No, there are not. This is what we get, Jana. I know it's part of what is a little bit, it's part of the conversation that I think is ongoing, which is why. Like, okay, so here are these rules, but what is it that we're supposed to understand about these rules?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to have a great answer for you about that, I am sad to say. Some people would say, well, that's the point. God said this is what we're doing, and so we're doing it. And we don't always ask questions about those things. And you could argue that a lot of the things in our tradition, especially things that come from the Torah, don't always feel like they have a good reason, but we do them anyway because that's what we're commanded to do, and that's what our people have done for thousands of years. And kashrut, I think, is really one of the preeminent things that falls into that category, that there isn't always a good answer. Then, if you want an answer, some people, a different answer, I guess, some people also argue that it was for health reasons, that these were animals that were unclean in some way, which makes sense because of the conversation we just see about how they're impure or unclean. And so it sort of contributes to that conversation around what does it mean to consume things that are healthy or clean or pure? We understand with a modern lens that some of these animals, some of which we'll see later, historically were known to be not clean animals for a lot of reasons. And so it could have been contributing to disease or things like that. But there's a sense now, okay, well, if that's the case, now that's not true. We know now how to eat things that are cleaner. So why do we still have to abide by that? Which you could argue is true of so much of biblical Judaism that we sort of have taken into our rabbinic Judaism, there are so many things that we're like, okay, why do we need to have 2 days of Chag on Rosh Hashanah? It started because they didn't know exactly what day the holiday started because of the way the communication worked. But now we have a calendar for the next 3,000 years and we can tell you exactly what day Rosh Hashanah is. Do we really need 2 days of it? But we still do 2 days. You know, there are a lot of things that we sort of uphold from biblical times, even though they might not feel quite as relevant now. But there is not ever a great answer to your question, hence my rambling. But that's the best I can do for now. Other thoughts about this section, these mammals. Was this new to anyone or familiar, or is most people knew this already? Pretty familiar to people? Okay. One other thing, Jana, that I want to say is that there's also some people's argument is that it was about holiness and separation, that these foods that we were told we could eat are seen as sacred or holy somehow, and that would bring us closer to God in some kind of holiness, that separation would help with that.
Can I say a theory that I heard one time, Rabbi Jensen?
Yeah, of course.
What specifically about pigs, that they are a high cost benefit ratio for an agricultural society in the desert. It's like too much food to it's like destabilizes a community or something because of how much feed it takes to grow a pig versus how, like something like that. So like maybe there were community building reasons for why certain livestock were better than others.
Great. There were community building or agricultural reasons also for these distinctions. Great. Love it.
I don't have a source, but I read it. So it's obviously true. No.
I think it's great. All things we read are welcome here. You're good. Okay, we are going to move into the next section, which is fish. So I think we often think of mammals and fish as sort of the two categories we know about. It's like no shellfish and no pork. Like those are the sort of big categories. That, of course, is not exactly true. Here's what we hear about fish. These you may eat of all that live in water. Anything in water, whether in the seas or in the streams that has fins and scales, these you may eat. But anything in the seas or the streams that has no fins and scales, among all the swarming things of the water and among all other living creatures that are in the water, they are an abomination for you. You'll see this language a lot, abomination. That's just the way they translate it. Seems much more intense in English in some ways. For you and an abomination for you they shall remain. You shall not eat of their flesh, and you shall detest their carcasses. Everything in water that has no fins and scales shall be an abomination for you. Okay, that's our fish category. What do we make of this one? Questions, thoughts?
I think
Mark?
all of them come down to, what I said in the chat for any of them, is that either whether it was a farming decision, agricultural decision, or it was a health decision, people aren't going to do it unless you convince them that something really bad's going to happen to them, and like pissing off God would be something really bad. So it always comes back to don't upset God. This is God's rule. It's not my rule. I didn't do it, but God says you got to do it.
And
Right.
these
Like-
are really strong words, detest, abomination.
Yeah, it's really intense language, and maybe that connects also to what Marcy's saying, that it sort of had to be made extreme for people to really listen to it or adhere to it, because if it just said maybe don't think about eating that shellfish, people would say I'm going to eat whatever I want. But if you say it with such strong language, people might actually hear it. Leah.
How I preface just about every question. What's with detesting carcasses?
great question. I don't have a great answer. That's just a phrase that shows up a lot. And we're gonna actually think about it a little more later because we're gonna look at some modern stuff, and there's a sense that maybe there's something about carcass that might be connected to some parts of the animal as opposed to others, or bones or skin connected to that. We're gonna look at that later. So it's some kind of description of clarification of what these different things are, because different parts of animals were used in different ways. And so, but I don't have a great answer for exactly why they use that language here. And this is a good time to warn you all. I will warn you that some of the stuff we're looking at later, some of the modern stuff, is a little bit gross. And we're probably going to see some stuff that you may think is a little bit like intense and much, but we're in the world of animals and kashrut, and that's just what we're going to be doing together. So just a heads up, if you have a weak stomach or if you are a meat eater, I can't make any promises. Okay, Susan.
My understanding is that there are a number of gray areas, and the Sephardim actually have a different list of forbidden fish to us. Things like sturgeon, which have both scales and fins at some point in their life, but not later. For Sephardim, will eat.
Yes, thank you.
Won't.
Yeah, there are different understandings of certain fish that sort of fall in a gray area. If they have fins and scales, swordfish is also one of these. If they have fins and scales at some point in their lives, but not later, does that count or not? So some people, some Sephardim, but also just some people categorize those separately. And some people say, no, it still is not a kosher fish. I'm not going to eat it. Great. Okay. We got to move on. We are moving on to birds. So here's what we have about birds. The following you shall detest among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. We have the same language we just saw. The eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the kite, which is sort of another bird of prey that's similar to these. Falcons of every variety, all varieties of raven, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, hawks of every variety, the little owl, the cormorant, which is a sort of large sea bird, the great owl, the white owl, the pelican, the bustard, the stork, herons of every variety, the hoopoe, and the bat. Hoopoe is this exotic looking, colorful bird with kind of a very bright top of their head. Very interesting to look at. And the bat. All wing swarming things that walk on fours shall be an abomination to you. But these you may eat among all the wing swarming things that walk on fours. All that have above their feet jointed legs to leap with on the ground. Very specific category and description. So some of those are locusts of every variety, all varieties of bald locust, crickets of every variety, and all varieties of grasshopper. So if you ever saw, some people eat like chocolate covered crickets, or whatever, kosher, enjoy. So any kind of cricket, grasshopper, locust is fair game for the taking, for the eating, all kosher. Good source of protein, definitely. What do we make of this bird category? It feels much more specific in some ways than the other categories. We just get a much longer list of what's in and what's out. Thoughts about this? Anyone we haven't heard from yet? Would love to hear some other voices. Yeah. Jill?
I think all of the birds of prey, the raptors, eat other creatures. They also eat carrion. That they eat dead animals, which I think would certainly make them not very kosher.
Great. So the eating of other things, especially dead animals, would make that animal certainly fall into the category of unclean or impure.
Unclean, for sure.
But the cormorant just catches fish. So that very much confuses me. I get the owls because they eat mice and that's kind of gross. But the cormorant eating fish, I just don't get that one.
I don't know, Sipra. I don't have a good answer on that one for you.
Maybe they eat the non-kosher fish, which means it's in their system, and then you're eating the bird that ate the non-kosher fish.
That's possible, I suppose.
There you go.
You watch them at the ocean. I don't know. It's weird. It's weird.
I have an idea about why you shouldn't eat predators.
Sure.
Maybe it maybe it destabilizes the ecosystem. So if you kill all the predators and eat them, then you're overrun with vermin. So it's just an idea.
Yeah. Yeah, there definitely are some things that relate to sort of the ecosystem, the agricultural cycle, all of those things that definitely come into play here. Like, why are these things in these ways? What else did we learn? Interesting. Okay, the hoopoe apparently is, Google says, not kosher because of its skunk-like stench. Okay, could be. I don't know. I had not heard that reasoning, but definitely could be. People have tried to make a lot of sense of these things for many generations. So there are many theories of why certain things have been in certain categories and not in other ones. And we don't necessarily have great answers for all of them, but there are, as always, with any Jewish question, a million different answers. So if one of them speaks to you, run with it. Other thoughts about, here's an answer for you, Sipra. Cormorants eat crustaceans. So that goes to Alicia's point about was it Alicia's point? About maybe they're eating things that aren't kosher. And crustaceans certainly fall in the category of not kosher. So that could be one of our answers. Does that convince you, Sipra, or no?
Yeah.
Okay. You're convinced-ish. Okay. Keep me posted. Elliot, did you want to say something?
Well, yeah, it's kind of interesting. You can eat crickets and locusts, but you can't eat literally any other insect. But I guess there's like a historical context with locusts. I mean, I guess locusts were a big pest, for agriculture for a long time. So maybe that's why.
Right. Locust is also interesting because I think we mostly have one association with locusts in our tradition, and it's not you can eat them. They are a scary, very overwhelming plague near the end of the 10 plagues. So,
isn't it Passover? It's number 10, like you said.
Yeah, it's in the later plagues. Sipra, what do you want to add?
No.
Oh, okay. Other thoughts about this category, which sort of we called birds, though crickets doesn't really fit into birds, but birds felt like a better category name. Other thoughts about it? Any thoughts about what we've seen so far in terms of mammals, fish, birds, anything that stands out to you in terms of differences or similarities in these categories?
A side note, no mention of horses anywhere. Were there not horses?
Yeah, horses don't show up here. Yeah, there are definitely some things that we would have expected to be included that were not. And horses, but for the record, they are not kosher because they don't have split hooves and they also don't chew their cud. So 0 for 2 on horses. Okay. Geography and availability. Yep. Those are definitely part of how these things, all of these categories developed. So far, we've covered land, air, and water. Yep, we have. Though we're going to cover land again, sort of, and in a different way. Other thoughts about what we've seen so far? Anyone surprised by anything?
Yeah, I don't think I knew about grasshoppers and locusts. I don't think I've ever heard that before.
Yeah. Well, it's not necessarily the first thing we think about because I think a lot of our conversations around Kashrut and especially the biblical sources are about the things that are relevant to our lives, or at least most relevant. So I think the main takeaways are the things related to mammals, mostly pigs, but also other things, and then also shellfish and other fish. And then we sort of overlook the rest of it because birds also, I mean, I guess you could put chicken in a bird category. That's a different conversation for another time. But we also don't eat a lot of birds necessarily. So those things don't always come into the conversation, and certainly not the crickets and grasshoppers. Fish and mammals have specific physical criteria. Great. Great. Other thoughts? Okay. we're going to move into our last category that we're going to look at in the Torah today, which the only way to really describe it is swarming things. So we're going back to sort of land now, as I mentioned before. And here's what we learn about this. The following will be impure for you from among the things that swarm on the earth: the mole, the mouse, the great lizards of every variety, the gecko, the land crocodile, the lizard, which is a different lizard, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. Those are for you the impure among all the swarming things. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be impure until evening. You shall not eat among all things that swarm upon the earth, anything that crawls on its belly, or anything that walks on fours, or anything that has many legs, for they are an abomination. Here's another category where we get a list of a lot of things that are impure, that we cannot eat, that also may surprise us, because it feels like, okay, you had that whole list, but you didn't have a horse or whatever else. Obviously, horse is just an example, but it is interesting the specificity that we get in some of these categories that we may not have expected. Do we really think that in biblical times they had a gecko and chameleon and mole and mouse in that language? I mean, obviously that's our translation of it, but there is a lot that has sort of carried over all of these generations in terms of what we are and are not allowed to eat. What do we make of this category? Does it change anything? Does it help us see anything else differently, or no?
What is added to the impurity is this thing that if you touch one of those animals that you're impure, that's dead, that you're impure for a certain amount of time. I just find that real fascinating.
Yeah, and we actually see that in other categories as well. I just didn't bring all of those verses.
Oh.
But it is part of what some of the descriptions are, which sort of makes sense, because there's, in the world, we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about this, but in the world of tameh and tahor, pure and impure, or ritually clean, ritually unclean, there's a lot of conversation around death and touching things that are dead, and that transfers some kind of ritual impurity to you for some amount of time. And so it makes sense, knowing what our tradition does with that it would translate that to this category. Though it is interesting, because we think about this as being, what do we eat or not eat? And so it's also a little bit strange to then have this thrown in the same part of the Parsha, because it feels like, okay, we're talking about eating, and then now we are suddenly talking about being ritually impure because of death, which feels very separate from what we're eating or not. But all of it was really connected to circle of life sorts of related things. Sipra, it's a great point. I don't know, but it is worth wondering. It is worth wondering. What do we think about this category? Any other thoughts about it? Is anyone compelled by any of this? Like, if I brought this to you and I said, okay, here are the 4 categories the Torah gives us for the animals, the forbidden animals, the prohibited animals, would anyone feel like, okay, I'm in, thank you so much, this is very convincing, and now I won't be eating these things that I was eating as of 12 o'clock today? Anyone feel convinced by it?
If it was like 3 things, it would be easier, but it's so many things and it's a lot.
Totally. It's like, if there were just 3 things and it said, don't eat these 3 things, God says so, you might say no problem. But instead, you're like, these 42 things that I have to keep track of, makes it feel almost less convincing, maybe, because it's like, that's too much. How am I supposed to follow that? As opposed to, here are 2 things not to do. Great. Other people who are convinced or unconvinced by it, what are your thoughts? This is all the biblical stuff we're going to look at today. This is where we get all of the things about what we do and don't eat, aside from the mixtures like milk and meat and everything that we're going to look at next week. So this is where all of Kashrut comes from, is in these verses that we looked at today, in terms of what are the actual forbidden animals.
I mean, a lot of these things I wouldn't eat anyways, you know?
I was going to say the same thing. There's some of them are just gross.
Yeah, and maybe we don't eat them because it has been in the Torah for, so long. Maybe that's why people don't eat them.
Maybe it's just evolved over time that these have then become some of the things that to us seem very off-putting anyway. Because in some cultures, plenty of these things people eat all the time that we think of as things we're definitely not going to eat. Some of that is a Western thing and not necessarily a Jewish thing, but definitely worth thinking about. Okay, how many of these things are really on the list of things we're eating on a consistent basis anyway? So yes, it's a very long list, but how much are we actually having to change what we're eating? I don't know. I don't know.
In the modern Western world, I think you touched on this earlier, kind of is no pork, no shellfish. It's a simplified version of the list. But I've known of people that have traveled to Thailand or other countries where some of these other foods are served and served readily.
Yep.
We're just not exposed to it mostly.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to worry in the US about telling people not to eat chameleons because we're already not eating geckos and chameleons.
Yeah. They're cute. Geckos are cute.
Why would you want to eat them?
Right. Yeah. Other people have thoughts about how much this does or doesn't convince them and why. Never be afraid to say you're not convinced by something. It's always welcome here.
I just get the feeling that there are reasons that are like lost to history. And it's not because it's like such a practical everyday kind of thing. Like if there's some I just have to think that there are reasons for an agricultural society to, I mean, not wanting to eat gross things, that's just like probably they just thought it was gross. But I think there are reasons and we just don't know them.
For sure. Yep. I think you're very right. And then Elizabeth says, I'm more compelled by the fact that others were compelled and for so long. Yes, Elizabeth, that is great. That is one of the things we're also going to talk about, especially when we get to the end of the class, about what are the reasons that we are compelled by Kashrut. And I think for a lot of people, it's a sense of peoplehood. This is what we've done for thousands of years. And by doing it, I bind myself to a people. And whether or not I completely understand or am convinced by the arguments biblically, it feels like this is what our people do. And so I do it. And it binds me to that kind of community, or my ancestors did it, or whatever else. And I love that. And I also agree with Alicia that I think a lot of the reasons are probably been lost to time in a lot of ways. So we are now going to really take a sharp left turn. So prepare yourselves. And we are going to look at a modern application of this. So as Jenna was just saying, we often say no pork, no shellfish. Like that's the simplest description of it. But there are, of course, many other questions. And one of the questions that has become a very hot button thing in the modern era, which we're going to call modern, but not this year necessarily, is the question about gelatin. So we're going to look with the rest of our time at gelatin and how that has become such a hot button issue for the 16 rabbis who really care about it, myself included, and why. And will you just raise your hand if you already have heard about or know about the fact that gelatin is a complicated question, halachically, in terms of Judaism, kosher stuff? Exactly. Okay, great. Some of you, yes, some of you no. Okay, so gelatin has become really one of the issues because the question is, how do we get gelatin, which we're about to look at? This is where we get into the sort of nitty gritty, in the weeds, gross adjacent part of the class. So enjoy. But I think it's very interesting. It's just a little more into the process of food than we generally talk about. And so the question is, what happens to make gelatin? And if it is with non-kosher animals, what's going to happen? Yeah, Jessica, yes, it will complicate sour gummy candy for you. But I will say by the end, it may uncomplicate it for you. So I may have convinced myself that it's fine, which I have never felt before. So we're going to see. But as I spoke to someone about this gelatin problem, she said to me, yeah, I also have sort of convinced myself it's fine, but I still don't eat it. She said, it's kind of like kitniot on Pesach, this category of foods that now we've sort of created reasons that they're fine, but a lot of people still feel like, I just doesn't feel right to me, even if I can make the intellectual argument that it's fine. So let's see where we land on gelatin today. We are going to start. This is a much more intellectual sort of adventure than we often go on. So here is what we are going to see. We're going to start. This is from Rabbi Isaac Klein, who wrote this very famous guide to Jewish practice that he's a conservative rabbi that in rabbinical school we used for everything. And here's how he explains the process of making gelatin, which will help you understand why it has become a modern halachic kashrut question. Gelatin is produced from dry bones of animals, kosher and non-kosher, and also from the skins of these animals. The bones are dried usually for a period of 6 months to a year. Are you following? Or are you you're already like, I can't talk about this stuff anymore. It's already gross. Okay, great. You're with me so far. Okay. At the end of the drying period, the bones become hard and dry as wood. The bones then undergo a long chemical treatment during which they are treated with hydrochloric acid, salt, lime, and other chemical compounds. So far, so good? Okay. The skins used for the manufacture of gelatin are dried until they become hard and brittle. Then they are treated with chemicals such as hydrochloric acid, salt, lime, just like with the bones. The skins are free of all moisture, fat, and meat, and their appearance and substance are thus completely changed. After the bones and skin have undergone the above chemical treatments, they are placed in large vats of running water, which removes all the impurities caused by the chemical treatments. The substance is treated again with chemicals, washed again, then transferred to large extractors where hot water is used to convert the substance into the final product, gelatin. Wow. Okay. It's a lot. I feel like I learned more about gelatin in that 3 paragraphs than I ever needed to know. Does this help us understand why it's a complicated thing? We have kosher and non-kosher animals. We're using their bones. We are distorting them, transforming them in a million ways, turning them into this strange substance that ends up in Jessica's sour gummy worms, bears, whatever they were. Sour gummy candy in general. So what do we think of this so far? Thoughts about this intro to the gelatin process and how it intersects with our kashrut questions?
It just sounds like trafe goo.
Exactly. Trafe goo. Great. Yep. Susan.
We have the problem, but first of all, he's saying it's from a mixed group of animals. It's not all kosher animals.
Great.
So that's red flag number 1.
Yep.
But secondly is we're clearly using animal products to make the gelatin.
Yeah. Great. Great. So you've already raised 2 great problems for us. 1, some of these animal bones are not from kosher animals. And number 2, there's just not clear what's happening with the other animal products, which aren't bones or skin. So there are questions about it. Jill?
Yeah, I think, to me also just, it's bones of dead animals. It's dead stuff.
Right.
That strikes me as not being particularly clean.
Great, great. So we're introducing this death category again, like dead animals, carcasses, bodies, things. What's happening with that? Okay.
And then also, and this may just be sensibility, is soaking stuff in chemicals, none of which sound very good. Doesn't strike me as maybe not so much unclean as unhealthy.
Great. So what's the distinction between unclean and unhealthy, and where do we draw those lines, and what matters to us in that conversation? Great. So we're going to look at what Rabbi Klein brings as the questions that we need to consider. And I brought 4 of his questions. He brings a million other questions. This comes from, I should have said this from the beginning. This comes from this chapter of his book, you can see it, which is the Kashrut of gelatin. So this is a whole article that he writes. We call them tshuvot, responsa. And there's a whole legal body in the conservative movement, which is where he comes from, that still to this day meets 25-member body that addresses these kinds of questions. And so some of what we're looking at comes from his 1969 tshuva, and some of it comes from the 2024 sort of response to his tshuva to sort of confirm whether or not his stance still holds from the 60s to now. And so this is how this works. There's a question and then an answer. And so he tells us there are four, well, I brought four, there are 8, but there are 4 questions we're going to look at. What's the status of bones? Because we know about a carcass, but are the bones included in that being not kosher? If the bones are part of that, can we change the status of them through the subjection to these chemical treatments? Because the chemical treatment transforms them so that they become a totally different thing that isn't even a food anymore. So far, so good? Okay. 3, do we differentiate between the case where an end product is a food eaten by itself versus where it's just an ingredient being added as a binder, but couldn't actually be edible? Because no one's having a bowl of gelatin. Yes, Jell-O could have gelatin as an ingredient, but it's not actually edible on its own. And so does that matter? Because we're not treating it as a food on its own. And 4, if we establish that the chemical transformation turns these bones into something new, does that also apply to the skins or just to the bones? Those are our 4 questions. Not quite the 4 questions we usually think of at Passover, but a different set of 4 questions. What do you make of these questions? Any immediate responses? Jessica.
To go down the sour gummy candy road, this is like how I've thought about it. As someone who doesn't eat meat, this is how I've made it okay for myself to eat that kind of stuff anyway, because it's like such a byproduct of a byproduct that it's almost like, what even is it anymore? Definitely not healthy, but maybe also not exactly a meat product, a pork product.
Great. It's like at a certain point, something is so removed from the original that it's not even, it's so not even recognizable that it just becomes something else. We don't know exactly what it becomes, but it's certainly not meat anymore. It's something else. Great. Other thoughts?
Well, I mean, like when you make like a chicken broth or chicken stock, you're using bones in that often. And it pulls a lot of the fat out of the chicken, and then you can skim the fat off and use the fat in cooking. It's like, you know, so that's, to me, sounds like a similar process. But yeah. There
are a lot of things we can think of where something is sort of being transformed, but is it being transformed enough that we don't see it as non-kosher meat product anymore, and we see it as far enough from that we could actually eat it? Hard to know. But Rabbi Klein would say, not hard to know. We do have an answer. Okay, so other thoughts about his questions before we start to look at his answers?
For me, I get for falling in the category of kosher-ish.
Yeah.
It's confusing. And
say more about confusing.
It's not an area that I've typically gone into the weeds on, so to speak. And again, I had never thought of all the chemical processes involved.
Right.
And I feel like that's something, it's like, I try to eat healthy or, organic or natural, whatever products. So that's more of something that I feel like I need to think more about, the whole chemical transformation piece. And then I don't know whether this is a side note, I've just, because not feeling well and my immune system is down right now because of, some surgery, that I've been buying and having bone broth.
Right.
And, here we're talking about bones as something that's dead, but on the other hand, bone broth is really rich with a lot of, the collagen and vitamins that you need. So I don't know where that fits with the discussion of bones.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you brought up some good points. And also, it's interesting, like not thinking about the chemical process totally makes sense. And now you're like, wait a second, now I have a whole new set of questions to sit with about the choices that I'm making.
Or I don't go out of my way, or what Marcy said earlier, almost as a throwaway that you read something's in a gelatin capsule.
Right.
And I've never thought twice about that, or even once.
Right. Right? Yeah. Marcy, this is the thing. Once you're in the weeds, it's hard to get out, but we're going to try to get out in the next 7 minutes somehow. So yeah, Marcy.
I'd like to know what the rabbi says about prescriptions and gelatin capsules, because as a vegetarian, I struggle with it all the time. And it is sometimes impossible to find a medication that I need that's not in a gelatin capsule.
Yep. Well, it's very hard. I know that there are definitely, I know some people who really spend all of their energy and time just trying to find things that don't have gelatin. Or I think Sipra had asked earlier about chicken or fish bones to make gelatin, and there is fish gelatin. And so a lot of times fish could be in parts of these things, for example, cod or things like that are kosher. And so sometimes you can find things that the clarification around the gelatin helps you understand it's not actually from non-kosher animals, but you don't always have that information. So, okay, we're going to keep going because I want to start to look at how they start to understand their decision about gelatin, which also may make you feel better, Marcy. Okay, so first we have this rabbi who says, and this is a sort of older rabbi, like Klein is like writing in the 60s. This rabbi's from 1800s probably. And he says, whatever the Torah has forbidden to eat only applies to substances which are edible, because it says you should not eat any carrion, for example. This is how it is with all forbidden substances. Therefore, bones, whether of carrion or of animals which have become treifa, which is where the word treif comes from, just impure, unclean, or of any other forbidden things which are hard, meaning inedible, and don't contain any fluid, they're permitted because they're just bones. And bones are just bones. They're not a meat, they're not a skin product, they're not anything else, just bones. So here's our first insight into the direction of maybe it's actually fine. What do we think? Anyone already feel like, yeah, it's probably fine? Or anyone feel like I don't believe him at all?
I think if it's made from non-kosher animals, it's non-kosher. It doesn't matter what you do to it.
Okay. Okay. We have a strong stance from Alicia. Great. Other thoughts?
I think that based on the prohibition against touching a carcass, like bones are part of a carcass, right? And that's for other reasons, but I don't know. Bones are part of the animal, in my opinion. So creating a food based on the bones would render it inedible, I think, if it were a non-kosher animal.
Great. Great. Okay. So we have some halachic sticklers in our crew today. Let's see what else we learn, because I hear you. I also, we're all going to sit with it. We're not going to have great answers. Here's what Klein will tell us. And this comes from a 20-page thing. I just brought some of his conclusions for us. He says, we would like to pursue the matter further and find out whether or not it's possible that gelatin made from bones is kosher, even according to the opinion that bones are included in the prohibition of forbidden foods, which goes to both of your points and Alicia's point of like, well, if it's not kosher, it's not kosher. And he says, but maybe not. Let's find out. He says, since to produce gelatin, the bones have to go through several chemical transformations so that the end product is a davar chadash. This is actually a halachic category, a Jewish legal category of something new, a new thing, that there's reason to believe that the original prohibition has been eliminated by that point, which also goes to Jessica's point about something sort of being so removed from the thing that it actually is something else. The term davar chadash, or panim chadashot, which originally is used by Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, reflects an important principle. When a substance goes through a transformation that changes it into something completely new, it also loses its former status in regard to being forbidden food. And according to the Shulchan Aruch, this very famous code of Jewish law, when a food becomes dehydrated to such a degree that it can be compared to eitz ba'alma, an ordinary piece of wood, it loses its status as a forbidden food. And the understanding is these bones, after going through this process so many times with all these different chemicals, become like wood. That's really the closest thing that you could compare them to. And so it doesn't have status as a forbidden food anymore. To sum up, gelatin made from bones or hides is kosher. Though this opinion is not unanimous, there are an increasing number of authorities who consider the product permissible. This was in 1969. The CJLS, the conservative movement body in 2024, confirmed that this is still true even with new chemical processes. They still rule that it's permissible. And yet, why does it feel so unconvincing? Or maybe it doesn't. What?
I have like an analogy that came to me, so I feel like,
Please.
okay. Does anybody know the fabric rayon?
Yes.
Okay, so that's made from technically plant material or corn that they like boil, and they do all these chemical processes to it, and then it essentially turns into like a kind of plastic. So it's sort of like, is it a natural fiber or is it a man-made fiber? It feels like it's pretty in between to me.
Right.
And this argument feels like it's so adulterated that it's in between. And to me, that feels very non-kosher.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that also it's important, the point that you raised, that it's really in the middle. That I think that the reason this is never going to be unanimous is that there are a lot of reasons to say, no, it just doesn't quite feel right. And you could argue, like he has, that it's so removed from the actual thing that we're not talking about anything that's not kosher anymore. We're talking about something that's like a piece of wood that's being used to create sour candy. Are we really so mad about it? I don't know. And sadly, we have to end our conversation because it's 1 o'clock and I know many of you have other things to do with your day, but this is just a tiny exploration into what Kashrut leads us into. We start with these verses that are sort of straightforward, at least in their categories. And then we end up in a 20-page tshuva about gelatin that then leads to another tshuva a year ago about gelatin and leads to 18 of us feeling like we're still not sure that we're going to have it. So I don't know, that's the interesting thing about Kashrut, is that it's not just about the letter of the law, it's also the spirit of the law. And there are things like gelatin that just feel to some of us wrong, just in our bodies. It just feels like, I don't know, the idea that a pork bone was something I'm now consuming, even if it's totally removed from being a pork bone, I don't know that I can do it. And so I don't know. I don't bring this to convince you either way. I don't know that I convinced you either way anyway, but just to sort of give you a sense of the conversations that we're having and the ways that our biblical conversation about these forbidden foods leads us to very modern conversations. I think sometimes with kashrut, people feel like, how do I access it? This is thousands of years ago. Like, I don't know. And so this is really one of the ways that we can think about how these conversations really continue for us. As Sipra brought up, there's also Rennet, which is another conversation that I chose not to bring for us today. But if you want to talk about it, email me. Happy to talk about it another time. We're not going to talk about it in this class. But there are a lot of things like this that we wonder about and we don't have great answers. And that's some of the fun of what this class is, and an opportunity to really think together about where are the sources that things are coming from, and then also how do we integrate those into our lives now. And we don't always have a good answer, but we're going to keep having questions about it, and we're going to keep having these conversations. Okay, we're going to close there for today. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for all of your insights and questions and thoughts. Please email me with kashrut questions you want answered in this class. I would love to try to answer them. And I will see you all next Wednesday, same time, same place. We'll be talking about forbidden mixtures, milk and meat, and such famous things, such famous catchphrases of Judaism. Great to see you all. Have a good week. Take care of yourselves. See you soon.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.